Thank you, Mr. President, Excellency, distinguished delegates. We can still change course towards a safer climate, even despite having experienced the 10 hottest years in recorded history and having crossed the 1.5-degree global temperature in 2024. But states do need to prioritize actions that have the highest scientifically proven capacity to protect the human rights of present and future generations now in this decade. Today, I am honored to present my report on the imperative of defossilizing our economies to the Human Rights Council. My report clarifies that as a matter of existing international human rights obligations, states must urgently phase out fossil fuels, which are the main cause of climate change. And there has already been significant progress in decarbonizing the energy sector. But despite the recognition of the need for a fossil fuel phase-out in the international climate change regime and in the Pact for the Future, fossil fuel extraction and use are still increasing. My report also draws on biodiversity science and health science to reflect on how fossil fuels are at the core of all other planetary crises of biodiversity loss, toxic pollution, and economic inequalities. Through their full life cycle, fossil fuels have severe and widespread human rights impacts across generations and sectors. Fossil fuels are everywhere, in our food systems, in our ocean, in our bodies, including in our brains, and in many cases without us knowing or choosing for them to be in our lives. They negatively impact on a range of human rights, from the point of exploration to that of waste management and decommissioning, further exacerbating climate change impacts. And human rights holders in the most vulnerable situations and facing multiple grounds of discrimination, including as a result of climate change, are bearing the brunt. This is the case of children, women, indigenous peoples, peasants, and small-scale fishers, among others. In my report, I recommend defossilization of our economies as a matter of international human rights obligations. This interpretation rests on the right to self-determination, the right to life and to live in dignity, and the obligation to prevent discrimination. It also rests on the obligation to ensure maximum available resources for the full realization of human rights. In fact, defossilization should be understood as an essential precondition for the right to development, which supports the right to self-determination and intergenerational equity. The right to development must be fully aligned with all substantive dimensions of the human right to a healthy environment, with a view to effectively tackling the planetary crisis we are facing and reducing poverty, including energy poverty and economic inequalities. In other words, defossilization is a precondition for the emergence of healthier development models for people and the planet, at the nexus of climate, nature, water, food, and health. So what does defossilization mean? It entails prioritizing the phase-out of fossil fuels, including various forms of financing them within and beyond the energy sector. It means recognizing and prioritizing the phase-out of fossil fuels as the single most impactful health contribution. Defossilization underscores the need to focus on fossil fuels also in connection with the growing production of plastics and petrochemicals, which cause an additional layer of human rights harms and further diminish nature's contribution to climate regulation and human resilience. Defossilizing our economies then means tackling all the financial benefits the fossil fuel companies are still gaining, effectively taxing exorbitant profits, phasing out subsidies, particularly those captured by high-income consumers and producers, preventing tax avoidance, and tackling the undue protection of fossil fuel companies under international investment law. And this is also about requiring fossil fuel companies to finance climate adaptation, mitigation, and responses to loss and damage. All these measures illuminate where the much-needed international climate finance can and must be coming from. Defossilizing our economies also rests on complementary human rights obligations to defossilize knowledge, to protect human rights in the formation of public opinion and democratic debate from undue commercial influence. Extensive independent research is relied upon in my report on the fossil fuel industry playbook. This research documents the evolving strategies to keep away from the public the industry's long-standing knowledge of the expected devastating impacts of climate change, including through corporate capture of public policy spaces and attacks against climate scientists and defenders. These strategies are yet another layer of human rights violations affecting our rights to information, science, and public participation in decision-making. These strategies have and are still preventing our efforts to ensure effective human rights protection from climate change impacts. So we need to prevent further climate obstruction and undo the effects of decades of practices that distort our current public debates on the fossil fuel phase-out. Another crucial obligation is that of critically assessing and reprioritizing energy demands by fairly and equitably distributing the benefits and burdens of defossilization. It is essential that the energy needs of those in most vulnerable situations are prioritized. And this, in turn, rests on assessing the extent to which the dependency on fossil fuels has perpetuated energy poverty and other inequities. Public participation processes must address energy overconsumption and exponential growth of energy-intensive data centers and AI applications, as well as assumptions about large-scale and concentrated models of energy production. And I will continue to reflect on these issues in my next report to the UN General Assembly on a human rights-based approach to renewable energy, including just transition minerals. I would also encourage all states to be ready to implement the human right to remedy in the context of defossilization. Effective remedies can support transformative change by reclaiming spaces for self-determination, for transforming our economies, and protecting the climate, nature, water, and food upon which our life depend. The most affected human rights holders are best placed, as discussed in my reports last year, to holistically assess impacts, including loss and damage they experienced, taking into account intersectionality and historical and structural discrimination. This is where the most effective and inclusive climate solutions can come from their lived experiences. The clarifications on human rights obligations in my report also shed light on the international duty to cooperate and to address defossilization in ongoing negotiations on climate change, tax justice, plastic pollution, and business responsibility to respect human rights. Furthermore, states should cooperate immediately in the implementation and monitoring of defossilization action. This should and could be done under the Paris Agreement, subject to significant reforms to tackle conflicts of interest of the fossil fuel industry. But if we do not see clear progress in these areas and the upcoming Conference of Parties, which will be held in late 2025 in Brazil, an alternative international process is needed. Such a process should integrate truth-telling and truth-listening methodologies of transitional justice approaches, as suggested in last year's UN Secretary-General report on loss and damage. International cooperation is of utmost urgency. In countries where extreme climate events have already been experienced for at least 10 years, as this is the case of Vanuatu, which I had the privilege of visiting at the end of last year, the compounded human rights impacts go well beyond the threshold of significant harm necessary to trigger extraterritorial obligations. In fact, those harms amount to serious and substantial harm to entire states and culture. I would like to thank Vanuatu for its excellent collaboration and cooperation with my mandate, and for its unwavering international leadership on climate action, which benefits everyone's human right to a healthy environment. My visit to Vanuatu focused on intersectionality, recommending action that ensures that children, women and girls, LGBTQIA+ persons are not left behind in the context of climate change. And I developed a series of recommendations to the international community, the UN system, and other international partners and bilateral donors in that context, given that Vanuatu makes a negligible contribution to climate change and is one of the countries most vulnerable to it. Those recommendations focus on the urgent need to make progress on climate mitigation, and notably the phasing out of fossil fuels, and to ensure the international cooperation is proportionate to the harm caused and responsive to locally and culturally grounded needs and approaches. In concluding my statement, I just wish to share that I am aware of the current geopolitical context and the difficulties that the implementation of my recommendations may face. But I would like to stress that defossilization action can and should take place immediately at any level, recognizing and supporting bottom-up, community-led, city-led, and subnational initiatives can help explore pilot approaches and facilitate mutual learning across levels and knowledge systems. We can nourish hope and share concrete learnings that can inspire a course correction within the current decade towards a safer climate for all. Thank you.